It's 1981, and Dick Gaughan is standing in a recording studio in Edinburgh with a fiddle tucked under his chin. He is about to record Handful of Earth. That album will be voted Album of the Decade by readers and critics alike. Not folk album. Album. His Irish grandfather, from County Mayo, played fiddle. His mother was a Highland Scot who spoke Gaelic. His Glaswegian grandmother played button accordion. Three traditions, three different kinds of loss, compressed into one man's hands. In the same years that Clyde shipbuilding collapsed, the industry that had built more than 25,000 ships since 1712, something astonishing was happening in the pubs and basements of Glasgow. A music scene was assembling itself from the wreckage, not in spite of the collapse, because of it. How did the city that built the Queen Mary, a colossus producing a quarter of the world's locomotives by the late 19th century, become the crucible of one of the most politically charged folk music scenes in the world? The answer starts with the river, and it ends with a fiddle. To understand what the folk scene grew out of, you have to feel the scale of what Glasgow once was. By the end of the 19th century, Glasgow was producing more than half of Britain's tonnage of shipping and a quarter of all the locomotives in the world. John Brown's yard in Clydebank built the Queen Mary and the Queen Elizabeth II. The word Clyde built became a synonym for something made so well it needed no further explanation. At its peak in 1938, Glasgow held a population of 1,127,000 people, the second city of the British Empire. That population had been drawn from the Scottish Highlands and Lowlands, and from Ireland, where the Great Famine of the 1840s had pushed hundreds of thousands across the water. Irish ancestry became the most common foreign ancestry in Scotland. In Glasgow's East End, in tenements along the Gallowgate and the Calton, Irish Catholic communities built a parallel city inside the city. Then the floor fell out. Deindustrialization hit the Clyde in waves through the 1960s and 1970s. Glasgow's population fell from that peak of over 1 million to around 650,000 by 2024. Urban renewal in the 1960s demolished tenements and relocated communities to new towns: Cumbernauld, Livingston, East Kilbride, shattering the neighborhoods Irish immigrant families had occupied for 4 generations. This is the moment the folk revival arrives. Not as entertainment, as a way of holding memory before it dissolved. In 1951, Hamish Henderson organized the Edinburgh People's Festival Céilí, a left-wing rival to the official Edinburgh Festival, later described as the beginning of the Second Folk Revival. By the mid-1960s, over 300 folk clubs were operating across Britain. Scottish folk clubs were less dogmatic than their English counterparts, mixing Scottish, Irish, English, and American material without anxiety. That openness would turn out to matter enormously. The clubs gave Glaswegians a place to grieve in public. But grief alone doesn't make music last. What built this scene into something permanent was a convergence of extraordinary people who each carried exactly the right combination of traditions. Start with Matt McGinn. Born in 1928, 8th child of a family of 9, raised in Calton, Glasgow's East End, deep in the Irish immigrant community. His formal education ended at 12. He became a communist, a trade unionist, and at 31 won a trade union scholarship to Ruskin College, Oxford. In 1961, he met Pete Seeger, who arranged a Carnegie Hall concert where McGinn met a young Bob Dylan. 2 years later, McGinn appeared on Broadside Ballads Volume 1 alongside Dylan and Seeger. His songs were recorded by Pete Seeger, the Weavers, and Luke Kelly of the Dubliners. People called him a people's historian, someone who could bring his musical ability, political knowledge, and personal experience together to leave a history in words and music of Glasgow's working life. He died in 1977, barely known outside folk circles. A blue plaque went up in Calton in 2019. While McGinn was writing Glasgow's industrial memory into song, Hamish Imlach was teaching the people who would carry the scene beyond Scotland. His hit Cod Liver Oil and the Orange Juice was banned by the BBC, at which point it became the most requested song on British Forces radio. He had been invited to join the Dubliners, but he stayed, and in doing so gave 3 careers their foundation. Billy Connolly learned raconteur performance from Imlach. Christy Moore learned his singing from Imlach. John Martin learned his blues guitar from Imlach. One man, 3 careers. Meanwhile, Clive Palmer, who ran a folk club on the 4th floor of a Saatchi Hall Street building in Glasgow, went on to co-found the incredible string band with Robin Williamson and Mike Herron. The band signed to Elektra Records in 1966. Their album The 5,000 Spirits, or The Layers of the Onion, reached #1 in the UK folk chart. Paul McCartney named it one of his favorite records of 1967. The Hangman's Beautiful Daughter the following year reached the UK Albums Chart top 5. Robert Plant later said Led Zeppelin found their way by playing Hangman's and following the instructions. And threading through all of this was Dick Gaughan. Born in Glasgow in 1948, he joined the Boys of the Lough in 1972, then formed Five Hand Reel in 1974, combining Irish and Scottish personnel in a Celtic rock band more popular in Northern Europe than in Britain itself. His voice, critics wrote, was capable of turning from aching tenderness to the high dudgeon of political rage within the space of a line. Here's the receipt. Handful of Earth, recorded in 1981, was voted Album of the Decade by Folk Roots magazine in 1989, winning both the Readers' Poll and the Critics' Poll. Not folk album, album. The fiddle had become an instrument of political testimony, Gaelic memory, and industrial fury. The question now is, why here? Why Glasgow and not London or Liverpool? Consider what London had that Glasgow didn't: recording industry, national broadcasters, career infrastructure. Liverpool had American R&B arriving by merchant ship. Manchester had its own industrial working-class culture. Any of these cities could theoretically have produced a folk revival. None of them produced quite this. 3 structural reasons explain it. First, the Celtic substrate. Irish immigration to Glasgow had been so dense and so sustained since the famine that Irish ancestry was the single most common foreign ancestry in Scotland. The folk clubs that opened in Glasgow's pubs in the 1960s weren't introducing an alien tradition. They were reconnecting people to something already in their families. Dick Gaughan didn't need to discover the Irish fiddle tradition. His grandfather played it. The music didn't arrive from outside and get adopted. It surfaced from inside. Second, the pub as social architecture. Glasgow's working-class culture was built around the pub in a way that differed from London's more dispersed scene. Folk clubs operated in pubs that were already community centers for the same Catholic Irish-descended communities industrialization had drawn together. Scottish clubs absorbed American material Lomax, and Henderson had collected work songs, protest songs, blues structures, and mixed it with Gaelic psalm-singing, Irish jigs, and lowland ballads without self-consciousness. The result was a hybridity that was specifically Glaswegian. Third, the political temperature. Glasgow's Clydeside had a history of labor radicalism dating back to the Red Clydeside movement after the First World War. When Thatcher's government dismantled the last remnants of heavy industry in the 1980s, culminating in the 1984 to 1985 miners' strike, the political temperature was already at pressure. Gaughan chaired the Leith Miners Support Group while his album about industrial working-class life was being voted the best record of the decade. His own words, "It was quite clearly time to stop reporting and start participating." English folk rock, after its initial creativity, drifted toward pastoral themes, medieval imagery, the village green. Glasgow's audience couldn't afford that drift. The tenements were being demolished. The yards were closing. Communities were being relocated to towns with no history, no pubs, no social memory. Folk music wasn't a cultural preference in Glasgow in the 1970s and 1980s. It was the one way of saying, we existed, we still exist, and this is what we sounded like. The music couldn't have come from anywhere with less to lose. The shipyards are gone. The tenements are gone. Most of the communities relocated to new towns never came back. But the music they generated is still generating. In 1978, Runrig released Play Gaelic, the first commercially successful album recorded entirely in the Gaelic language. It proved that the language colonialism and industrialization had spent a century trying to extinguish still had an audience large enough to sustain a career. Caper Cayley combined Scottish folk music, electric instruments, and Gaelic vocals from the 1980s onward, and their sound traveled to Japan, to North America, to European festival stages where audiences had no Scots or Gaelic and were nonetheless moved. The Waterboys brought the Celtic folk tradition to a mainstream rock audience. The Pogues combined Irish folk with punk attitude in a way that gave the whole tradition a new generation of listeners who had never been near a folk club. Scholars of Celtic rock have noted that whereas in England folk rock subsided into a subcultural soundtrack after its initial mainstream recognition, in Scotland, Ireland, Wales, and Brittany, it remained at the forefront of musical production. The music that England treated as a charming footnote stayed central in the places where it had grown from need. Glasgow was awarded European Capital of Culture in 1990. The folk scene had spent 3 decades building a cultural infrastructure in the spaces the factories left behind. Hamish Henderson's Freedom Come All Ye has been seriously proposed as an alternative Scottish national anthem. The song that emerged from a left-wing rival festival now carries the weight of national identity. Back to that Edinburgh studio in 1981, Dick Gaughan with his fiddle. Irish blood, Highland memory, Glaswegian fury in his hands. We asked at the start how a city of steel and smoke produced acoustic ballads and protest songs. The answer is that it didn't happen despite the steel and smoke. It happened because of them. Industries collapse and leave silence. What Glasgow built into that silence, with Irish fiddles and Gaelic words and the accumulated political anger of 3 generations of working people, was something more durable than any ship ever launched on the Clyde. The fiddle is still being played. The argument is still being made. And here is the question the music itself keeps asking, still unanswered. If the Glasgow folk scene needed industrial collapse to reach its full voice, does that mean the cities losing their industries today are the ones we should be listening to most closely?